Welcome back to We Get Mac. We're going to continue learning more about the principles of macroeconomics. Okay, so if you know, we just took exam 3, so now we're at the end of the semester, where we're going to learn more about how to put everything that we talked about so far in the semesters together. So we're going to be able to discuss models, one model that is going to be an aggregate model of the entire U.S. economy. Okay, and we're going to be able to decide, hey, what types of policies can we implement to help the economy achieve its so desired goals. So that's the idea here. Okay, I'm going to do this through the model so-called aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Okay, so like I said, we're going to understand what that model is. We're going to understand how to shift the curves into that model, like we did for the demand and supply model for the first exam. And we're going to learn what type of views play a role in terms of determining policies for this economy, for this type of economy. Okay, and economic model. So here's a quick recap. Why do we learn about these models, right? If you remember, just from the first, all the way from the first exam, it's a way to get really complex problems, right? Reality is really complex. There's a lot of factors influencing the decisions of everybody, right? But we try to find a way to model it in a more simplified way, so then we can at least derive some implications that can be useful for us today. Okay, and hopefully throughout the chapter, this is going to make more sense to you. Okay, and we're going to be able to see, hey, if we know how to model this, which type of view, economic view in terms of economic growth, helps the economy to grow faster or get where it needs to be faster. Okay, so we're going to look into a macro perspective of that all the way from the beginning, that model that we saw of, and I apologize for that. Let me get that back. There you go. Of demand and supply. Okay, we have quantity, we have price, right? We have a supply, and we have a demand. We're going to look at that instead of being for one market, we're going to analyze this for the entire US. Okay, so we're going to expand that model to an aggregate model of the entire US economy. Okay, that's the idea. And of course, as we talk about views, you know that, hey, if there's two curves on that model, and more will come in this one, but the main ones that we talked about so far are demand and supply. And guess what kind of views are conflicting and play important roles into determining policy? Whether or not you believe that the country should grow through stimulating the supply or stimulating the demand. And that's exactly what historically we have seen. There's other views as well, but for just this chapter, we're going to focus on these two. Okay, so the first one I want to talk about is the supply one. So this talks about, relates to Say's law, which says that supply creates its own demand. In other words, each time a firm sells a good or a service, that price becomes revenue, right? That revenue becomes somebody's income, and that income is going to be used for expenditures and consumption. So in other words, as long as we're supplying goods and services, people are going to keep getting paid for their jobs, and they're going to be able to use that money to buy more. That's the idea. Okay, we're going to see that through the aggregate supply curve, and we're going to connect to the name and the neoclassical view all the way at the end of the chapter. So this is just kind of a preview of what's coming at the end. Okay, so what's the opposite view? The opposite view we're talking about is the Keynesian view, so the demand side. In other words, hey, doesn't matter what you're producing. If people don't want to buy it, you're not going to make money. So what matters here is that we need to make sure that we're stimulating people to buy more goods and services. If they're buying more goods and services, that's going to bring more firms into the economy, the supply is going to increase to try to meet those needs, and that's how we're going to grow. So you can see two different views here, and hey, imagine you're in a recession right now, like we are right now due to the pandemic, right? How do you stimulate the economy? Do you help suppliers to produce more goods and services? Or do you help people through stimulus like the one we're seeing right now? It's one of those, right? It's trying to stimulate maybe the aggregate demand, because we're getting that money, that stimulus, that $1,200 each, if you're making less than $75,000 a year, right? So you can then spend. So that's one way to think about, hey, they're trying to help the aggregate demand to grow. Okay, so as you can see, it's going to be very cool. We're going to be able to connect to a lot of things that's going on right now. So how do we build this model? Let's start with the aggregate supply side. Okay, it's going to be very useful, like I said, especially into understanding economic fluctuations in an economy. Okay, so the aggregate supply here is going to be just an analysis of the total quantity of output, real GDP here, and its relationship to the aggregate price level. So it's going to be the aggregate supply curve here is going to be the combination of pairs of aggregate price level and real GDP. Okay, so as you can imagine, we're going to have a graph similar to what we saw before, okay, which has quantity in the bottom on the x-axis and the price level on the y-axis. Okay, the price level here is going to be just like we saw before, we saw, for example, if it was the market for bread, we saw that on the y-axis was the price of bread, and on the x-axis, the quantity of bread. So now if we're looking to the quantity being real GDP, we're going to look into the price of real GDP to be able to determine the y-axis. And this is going to be called the GDP deflator. Okay. Oh, Eddie, that sounds very familiar. Yeah, we learned about this on the GDP classes. So this is, once again, connecting everything that we talked about in the semester in this last quarter of the semester. Okay. So let's further understand how to decompose that curve and understand it fully. Okay, not just memorize what it means, because what's the point of that, right? So okay, so we know there's a GDP deflator. We know there's real GDP in the aggregate price level. As you can see, I'm going to do this very slow, and you can see that I tell you exactly how I'm going to call those moving forward. So some of the defining some terms of some variables they're going to keep using. So for now on, just think about Y as being real GDP and P as being GDP deflator. That's the idea here. Okay, and this GDP deflator is going to be an index out of 100. Okay, so 100 being 100% being nothing has changed, right? Stay the same. But if it goes up from 100 based on the base year, that means it's increasing. So it's the same idea that we saw in our GDP class when we talked about index numbers. So this applies here as well. And please let me know if you have any questions. As always, I don't mind meeting during office hours as well. Okay, so let's further understand even more in terms of why is it shaped this way. Right, so you can see this is not very different, once again, from that supply curve that we saw on the beginning of the semester. But this one is shaped a little different. Why? This is what we're going to understand here, okay? Why it's shaped this way, and also why is it shaped up? Why is it positive? Why it has a slope that's a positive, okay? So take a moment to think about here. Why is that the case? And maybe going through this question can help you a lot, okay? So as the aggregate price level increases, the quantity produced increases in the economy. Why is this the case? Take a second here and try to answer it, and then come back to this video, press play again, and then please see if you got it right. And if not, let me know, and we can definitely discuss it more. Okay, so hopefully it took some time to try to solve this, and let's now try to solve it together. Okay, so what's the idea here? Why is this relationship holds of as the price level increases, the quantity produced in the US also increases? Okay, that's what we're thinking about here. Well, if you remember, the biggest thing here is that the assumption that this model brings, which is the whole point of doing this exercise, is to really point us out. The assumptions that we saw on the model for demand and supply on the first exam still hold here. And what are those? Ceteris paribus. Okay, in other words, the only variables that are allowed to change in this case when you're doing this graphical analysis is the two variables represented on the two axes. In other words, any other variables are being held constant by assumption here. Okay, this also includes the price of inputs, because once again, this is the GDP deflator. So it's only representing the price of the final goods and services produced within a country, in this case, the US domestically, right? So if that's the case, we know that, hey, as the price level, the final of those final goods go up, we know that those input prices are being held constant by assumption in the model, then guess what? This means that, hey, if the price level goes up, my margin of profit, right, how much profit I can generate per selling each unit of good or service goes up. So I'm more incentivized to produce more goods and services, okay? And you can see that in this case, the answer would be A, okay? So that's the main idea. Don't forget here that the assumptions of the first models that we saw about the demand and supply, that everything else is held constant besides the two variables being represented in the graph, still hold here, okay? Okay, you can see that it's exactly what I pointed out here. And we're going to keep understanding this. So as you can see, I'm going to kind of introduce the methodology. I'm going to introduce the concepts, and I'm just going to go through the slides as if we're going to go in class. And please make sure that you go through them slowly at home, and then you can then tell me if you have any questions so we can address those through the virtual class. Okay, so the other one I want to point out here is that we're going to have one more curve here in terms of the supply. And this is going to be very, very interesting in our analysis. And it's going to call the potential GDP curve. In other words, it's just the output, it's an amount of output an economy can produce based on the assumption that everybody's employed, in terms of all workers are employed, there's all the physical capital, machines, land are all being used, right? Technology is being all used in terms of everything that's created already. Okay, so based on the legal institutions, based on the way the markets are set up right now, so how efficient can we produce given the current scenario in an economy? Okay, given that everybody that could be employed is employed and so on. Okay, so that's the idea of what the GDP potential GDP curve shows us. In other words, you can also call it the full employment GDP, okay? In other words, the goal here, as you can see, is that we kind of want to get to the point where we're producing equal to potential GDP, because it means it's the most efficient level of production here, right? But you can see now that we can also produce more than that, and that's going to be something important to keep in mind moving forward with this model. Okay, so let's kind of recap something that we talked about before. As you can see that we're putting this all together, is that if we know that full employment GDP is equal to the most efficient level of production, given the current economic scenario and institutional setup, what is the unemployment rate at that point? 0%, 3 to 4%, 10%, or 15%? When GDP equals to potential GDP, what should we expect based on what we talked about unemployment? So take a second and try to solve this one as well. It's going to be very cool to talk about it too. So hope you took some time and try to solve it. And if you remember, this is definitely going to come back to the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, so the full employment is equal to the natural rate of unemployment in the US. And if you remember, the natural rate of unemployment still takes into consideration frictional and structural unemployment, those long run types of unemployment. So it's not going to be zero. Rather, there's always still a little bit of unemployment in the economy because people are still trying to match with, workers are trying to match with firms that want those specific skills. Or there's also migration, so sometimes it takes a little bit of time to get a job. And there's a lot of structural unemployment too, right? There's a lot of people that the firm, the industry has evolved, but their skills haven't evolved, so now they cannot find jobs. Okay, so that's why in this case, it would be around 3 to 4%, around 3.5%. That's the natural rate of unemployment estimated for the US currently. Okay, as you can think about 10, 15%, that's way more. So that would be already a recession based on the numbers that we talked about so far in this class. Okay, so the main idea here is that you can see that you're going to start to connect how employment, unemployment, and the relationship between potential GDP with the current level of GDP in an economy. Okay, so stay tuned and I'll come back with more videos in a second.